The writer does not give his name, but here's what he writes. I'm from South Central Kentucky. When I was 12 years old, we lived on a dairy farm across a gravel road from my cousin's house. At the time, I was raising some baby chicks that I kept on a high shelf in a tall shed that paralleled the back of my cousin's house. And I kept them there to keep any animals from getting to them. One night, my cousin was over and we were watching TV when I suddenly realized I had forgotten to feed my chicks. My mom handed me a mostly empty box of Quaker Oats, and my cousin, my little sister, who was 3 years younger than us, and I went out to feed the chicks. My cousin's driveway had just recently had a new load of white gravel poured on it, and the moon was full that night. We could see just fine without the flashlight, but I took one with me anyway so I could see inside the shed. The shed door was standing half open, so we walked inside and I flipped on the flashlight. The shelf where the chicks were on was 6 feet up. I had to use a ladder to reach them, but I wanted to make sure they were out of harm's way. And as I swung the beam around to face the shelf, I got the shock of my life. Standing there on its hind legs with its front paws on the shelf was a huge white dog-like animal. Well, one of us screamed. I couldn't tell which one of us it was, but that prompted the dog thing to drop down on all fours. My sister and my cousin took off running for the house, but I was frozen in place. This thing was hunched in its back, and it started moving toward me with one of my baby chicks still in its mouth. Its face was covered in blood, and it snarled, showing me its teeth as it moved closer. I could see its red eyes glaring at me, and I knew it was going to pounce on me, but still, I couldn't move. Please, dear Lord, let me move, my mind cried as it got within 5 feet of me. Instantly, I felt myself spring into action. My sister and cousin had already reached the house when I broke into a hard sprint. The new gravel pulled my feet out from under me, and I found myself spilling across my cousin's driveway. As I tried to get up, I looked back and saw that thing, that monster, standing on its back legs in the moonlight. It reared its head and screamed a terrifying howl like a dying woman, and then it looked at me, and by then I was back on my feet and I took off for the house. I bolted through the screen door to find my cousin and my sister, trying to explain to my dad what had happened, what they saw, and I tried to tell him too. We wanted him to go check, but he wouldn't go outside. He insisted that we didn't see anything, and to tell you the truth, I think he was afraid. I heard a lot of stories about men out raccoon hunting when their dogs wouldn't leave the campfire, and maybe that's what my dad was thinking of that moment. I don't know what I saw that night, but if that was what kept good hunting dogs from leaving the safety of a roaring campfire, it made perfect sense to me. 2 years later, we moved 5 miles down the road. We had a big collie then. That dog wasn't afraid of anything, or so we thought. One summer night when the moon was full, we heard it scratching at the door, trying to get inside. Daddy opened the door and that dog almost knocked him down trying to get past him. About that time, we all heard the same ungodly scream I recognized from that night in the shed, and my dad and I stepped outside to see what it was, and in the field next to the house was that same white dog-like creature standing on its hind legs in the moonlight. Dad ushered me inside where we watched from the window as that thing dropped down on all fours and walked away. And the next day we went to the field to look around. We found some white hair and the barbed wire fence around it, but we never saw the creature again. I've since heard stories of others who have seen it, though. To this day, I think about that monster that killed all of my baby chicks that night, and it ate most of them. This email is from Brian. It's a Bigfoot story, and he claims it's true. My father was a logger, a forest ranger, a mechanic, an iron worker, and a welder. He and I spent a great deal of time in the woods together. My father was no stranger to the wilderness. My paternal grandfather had been a fisherman until he enlisted and went to fight the Kaiser in World War I. A short time after arriving in Belgium, a shell exploded 3 feet from him and practically ripped him to shreds. But he survived, and he spent about a year in the hospital in England until the doctor sent him home to Newfoundland, telling him that he would never fish again and probably never work again. He went home and proved the doctors both right and wrong. He never did fish again. Instead, he chose to start logging and sawing lumber with the assistance of his sons. My grandfather's mill was located at the mouth of a short, heavily timbered valley where they cut about 15 to 20% of their lumber. They practiced selective cutting and did a 5 or 6 year rotation, moving to a new area each year. As each son came of age to work in the mill or the woods, grandfather warned them to never, under any circumstances, be caught in the valley after dark. He never did give a reason, but grandfather was stern enough in his warning that none of the brothers ever disregarded his advice. My father told me that sometimes late in the evening when they were doing their post-workday maintenance by lantern light, they would hear strange sounds coming from the valley. There would be wood knocks and growls and screams and owl hoots and whistles and brush breaking and occasionally the sound of an animal dying. None of the brothers ever saw anything, and grandfather never admitted to seeing anything, but they all knew that there was something terrifying in those woods. The neighbors nearby and in the surrounding villages knew that the valley was occupied by demons, and nobody went there after dark. The fear lasted up until the 1960s when I was a boy, and it was my father who delivered my warning. The mill had been shut down in 1949 due to political issues, and everyone found alternative employment. But the brothers and grandfather still operated it now and then for personal use. One day in the early 1950s, a friend of my grandfather's arrived at the mill with his horse and sleigh to go into the valley to cut some firewood. Well, grandfather was there at that time, and since it was late in the day, he reminded his friend to be out of the valley before it got dark. The friend scoffed at the advice and headed out anyway. Grandfather finished sawing his lumber around dusk, and he loaded his trailer and began oiling and greasing the bearings in the mill. And all of a sudden his ears picked up the sound of pounding hooves and a voice yelling at the horse to go faster. Grandfather looked up in time to see his friend and the horse coming tearing out of the valley, towing an empty sleigh. Grandfather intercepted the horse and managed to bring it to a halt. Both man and horse looked wild, and it took a while for grandfather to calm them both down. When his friend regained enough of his composure to speak, his first words were, "I should have listened to you." He had gotten about halfway through the valley when he saw an ideal spot for cutting. He gave the horse some feed and water, and then he went to work. A couple of times he noted that the horse had seemed fidgety. He couldn't see anything wrong, so he returned to his work. He recalled several times hearing something moving around in the brush, but passed it off as being a moose or some other form of wildlife, and he ignored it. By dark, he had a load cut and was almost ready to head home. He picked up his gear and was about to secure it with the load ropes when all hell broke loose. A huge, hairy, man-like creature burst out of the trees. It was a giant. It was 8 feet tall and probably weighed 500 pounds, he said, and it was screaming and gnashing its teeth and breaking off trees as it rushed forward. According to the man, it probably broke off more wood in a few seconds than he had cut all afternoon. What scared him most were its eyes. They were glowing red and contained more pure evil than he had ever encountered in his life. "I'm never going back into that valley again," he swore to my grandfather. And with that, he snapped his reins and headed home as fast as he could. And he kept his vow, and he never returned. As a child in the 1960s, we used to ride our bicycles near the mill to play in the shavings and sawdust in the nearby river. We always had fun, but we never felt comfortable there in the evenings. We always felt like we were being watched, and we always made sure to be home after dark. Thanks for joining me on this podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you listening this far. And stand by. I'll have another one up in a day or two. I appreciate you guys, and I hope you're having a good week. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks.